There are moments in history when the world seems to pause, when a single breath, a single hesitation, a single decision becomes a difference between survival and collapse. Imagine an empire that once terrified continents, an empire whose armies thunder across 3 continents, an empire that crowned sultans like demigods. Now imagine that empire standing on a quiet balcony in the dead of night, its ruler staring into the darkness over Bosphorus, knowing that every prayer uttered from every trembling home across his realm rests on him, and that his next move could either save everything or doom it forever. That is where our story begins. But to understand how a proud empire suffocated under the weight of its own choices, we must go back to the moment when confidence outweighed caution, when pride overshadowed wisdom, and when one man, armed with absolute power yet blinded by desperation, waged the future of millions on one last throw of the dice. They say empires are born in ambition and crushed by hubris. The story of the Ottoman Empire, one of history's most enduring dominions, is no exception. Stretching over 6 centuries, this empire carved its name across 3 continents, dominating trade, culture, and warfare. Its reach extended from the wind-swept plains of Anatolia to the sun-scorched deserts of Arabia, from the intricate canals of Egypt to the fertile lands along the Danube. Yet, in the blink of an eye, what took centuries to build could be undone by a single decision, a moment of fatal miscalculation. That moment would come under the reign of a sultan whose ambition, pride, and relentless desire for glory would ignite a chain of events that the empire would never recover from. The Ottoman Empire was more than a political entity. It was a living, breathing organism. Its heart beat in the bustling markets of Constantinople. Its mind plotted strategies in the grand chambers of Topkapi Palace, and its strength radiated from the discipline of janissaries who marched with unflinching loyalty. For hundreds of years, this empire had survived wars, rebellions, and the shifting tide of history. It had outlasted rival kingdoms, absorbed cultures, and adapted to change. Yet no fortress, no army, no amount of diplomacy could shield it from the vulnerabilities that came from within, vulnerabilities born not from its enemies, but from the human nature of its leaders. By the time Sultan Mustafa II ascended to the throne, the Ottoman Empire was already at a crossroads. The 17th century had been a turbulent era, with borders under pressure from European powers, internal revolts testing loyalty, and an economy strained by costly wars. Yet Mustafa, young and charismatic, inherited a court brimming with loyal ministers, seasoned generals, and advisors eager to guide him. In his early years, he showed promise, decisive, intelligent, and aware of the empire's global significance. But the world around him was changing faster than the old guard could anticipate, and Mustafa's vision for the empire clashed with the harsh realities of the time. It began with small choices. Decisions that seemed strategic at the moment would slowly accumulate into a web of missteps. Mustafa's advisors warned against overextension, cautioned patience, and counseled prudence. But the Sultan was ambitious, haunted by the legacy of his predecessors who had expanded the empire to unprecedented heights. He dreamed not only of defending what the empire already possessed, but of reclaiming lost glory, of striking fear into the hearts of rivals, and of cementing his own legend as the Sultan who would make the Ottomans invincible. In 1683, that ambition led him to the fateful decision that historians would call the turning point of the empire. The Habsburgs in Europe had begun to challenge Ottoman influence in Central Europe, a region long considered a strategic buffer zone. Vienna, the heart of European power, had been a symbol of both threat and opportunity for the Ottomans. Mustafa, convinced of his empire's military superiority, decided on an audacious campaign, a full-scale siege of Vienna. It was a gamble that could either immortalize him as the greatest sultan or shatter the empire's foundations forever. The preparation for the campaign was meticulous, yet tinged with overconfidence. The Sultan marshaled one of the largest armies the empire had ever seen, drawing soldiers from the Balkans, Anatolia, and even North Africa. Supplies were amassed, artillery positioned, and scouts sent ahead to assess enemy defenses. Mustafa's generals, seasoned veterans of countless campaigns, understood the magnitude of the undertaking. They understood the risks, the potential pitfalls of overextended supply lines, harsh winters, and an enemy fortified in a city that had repelled invaders before. Yet the Sultan's determination was unyielding. Every warning was met with charm, deflection, or outright dismissal. As the Ottoman forces approached Vienna, the tension in the air was palpable. Villagers fled, spies reported movements, and the city's defenders braced for what they feared was inevitable. The initial assaults demonstrated the empire's strength. The artillery could breach walls, cavalry could dominate open fields, and janissaries moved with precision. But as days turned into weeks, cracks began to appear. Logistics faltered, morale wavered, disease spread among the troops. Supplies dwindled, and winter's chill gnawed at the soldiers who had once marched with unshakable confidence. Meanwhile, Mustafa's personal decisions compounded the military challenges. He grew increasingly isolated, listening only to those who praised his judgment. Advisors who raised caution were sidelined, generals who suggested retreat were dismissed, and dissenting voices within the court were quietly eliminated or ignored. This hubris, subtle at first, began to dictate the course of the siege. The Sultan believed that sheer will and determination could overcome any obstacle, that the empire's legacy alone was enough to secure victory. The turning point came when reinforcements from Europe arrived. A coalition of forces, led by the Polish King Jan III Sobieski, advanced toward Vienna with a determination equal to the Ottomans. They understood the stakes. A fall of Vienna could have altered the balance of power in Europe for generations. The Ottoman army, exhausted and overstretched, faced a disciplined, well-coordinated force with fresh supplies and reinvigorated troops. Mustafa, however, was unwilling to retreat, unwilling to reconsider the plan that he had poured his reputation, pride, and empire's resources into. The battle that ensued was catastrophic. The Ottoman army, once a symbol of fear and dominance, found itself encircled, outmaneuvered, and disoriented. The janissaries fought valiantly, but leadership had faltered and cohesion broke under pressure. Mustafa's decision to press forward rather than consolidate or retreat led to disarray. The siege that was supposed to immortalize him instead became a narrative of failure. Entire units were decimated, artillery was lost, and supply lines were cut. By the time the Ottoman forces withdrew, the campaign had drained the empire of men, wealth, and confidence. The consequences of this single decision rippled far beyond the battlefield. The empire's European neighbors, once cautious and respectful, smelled vulnerability. Internal dissent grew. Provincial governors began asserting autonomy, sensing that the central authority was weakened. Economic strain worsened as the cost of the campaign crippled the treasury. Trade routes became precarious, and famine loomed in some regions. Mustafa himself faced the reality of failure, a bitter recognition that ambition without strategy, pride without caution, could bring even the mightiest empire to its knees. Yet history is rarely kind in nuance. Mustafa, too, would be remembered not for the decades of competent rule or minor victories he had achieved, but for the gamble that almost destroyed centuries of Ottoman power. The siege of Vienna became a cautionary tale, cited in military academies and diplomatic treatises for generations, a lesson in hubris, overreach, and the fragile balance between ambition and wisdom. The Sultan's last gamble was a turning point, but it was not the end. The empire would survive for another century, clinging to its territories, reforming armies, and navigating shifting alliances. Yet the aura of invincibility was gone. Rivals tested boundaries with newfound audacity. Internal factions, emboldened by perceived weakness, grew bolder. The myth of an eternal, unassailable empire had cracked, and the shadow of vulnerability stretched long over the Ottoman world. What makes this story so compelling is not merely the political or military drama, but the human element at its core. Mustafa, too, was not a villain. He was a man of his time, a product of an empire built on conquest, loyalty, and ritualized hierarchy. His fatal decision was not born of malice, but a belief in his vision, belief in his strength, belief that history could be bent to the will of one man. And yet, it was precisely that belief that catalyzed a cascade of events that would alter the destiny of an empire, one that had endured centuries and spanned continents. In the aftermath of the siege, the empire reeled. Soldiers returned broken, families mourned, and generals debated what had gone wrong. Mustafa, too, faced not only military defeat, but political fallout. Court intrigue intensified. Rivals within the palace sought to capitalize on the Sultan's weakened position. Foreign powers, emboldened by the Ottoman setback, pressed demands and negotiated treaties that further chipped away at the empire's influence. Each step reflected a simple, brutal truth. One miscalculated decision by a ruler could have consequences that resonate across generations. As we examine the fall of the Ottomans through the lens of this pivotal campaign, it becomes clear that history is never determined solely by armies or borders. It is shaped by choices and decisions of individuals who carry the weight of nations on their shoulders. Mustafa II's gamble reminds us that leadership is not merely about ambition or courage. It is about foresight, humility, and the wisdom to recognize when strength must be tempered with prudence. The empire that once seemed eternal was, in reality, as vulnerable as any human institution. Its fate intertwined with the imperfection of those who led it. The siege of Vienna, and the decision that led to it, stands as a symbol of the fragility of power. It is a story repeated across time, in empires large and small, in kingdoms and corporations alike. The allure of glory, the temptation of decisive action, the desire to leave a mark on history, these impulses are universal. Yet history also shows the peril of ignoring counsel, of allowing pride to overshadow reason, and of underestimating complexities of the world. Mustafa II's story is a lens through which we can examine the eternal tension between ambition and wisdom. Even today, 6 centuries later, the echoes of that campaign resonate. The Ottoman Empire, once an unstoppable force, serves as a reminder that no power is eternal. Every decision, every gamble, carries weight. The Sultan's last gamble was more than a military error. It was a turning point that reshaped the balance of power in Europe, tested the resilience of civilization, and underscored the limits of human ambition. And as we reflect on this story, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that history is shaped not just by destiny, but by the choices of men's choices that can elevate or destroy, often in the span of a single moment. The empire had survived sieges, rebellions, and decades of political turbulence, but the scars of Mustafa II's gamble would remain. The Janissaries, once the backbone of Ottoman strength, demanded reform. Provincial governors sought autonomy. The treasury struggled to recover. And perhaps most significantly, the perception of Ottoman invincibility, the aura that had allowed it to dominate for centuries, was irrevocably damaged. Power, it seemed, was as much psychological as it was material, and the empire had lost both. Yet even in defeat, there was resilience. The Ottoman Empire adapted, rebuilt, and continued to influence the world for generations. But the shadow of the Sultan's fatal choice loomed over every decision that followed. It served as a warning to rulers, a lesson to historians, and a reminder to all that the line between triumph and catastrophe is perilously thin. Ambition is a double-edged sword, and in the hands of even the most capable, it can lead to ruin. The aftermath of the failed siege reverberated far beyond Vienna. For the Ottoman Empire, the consequences were not merely military, but deeply political, social, and economic. The aura of invincibility that had once surrounded the Sultan and his court was gone, replaced by uncertainty and unrest. Even as Mustafa II returned to Constantinople, he found a court rife with whispers, rivalries, and silent accusations. The grand halls of Topkapi, once symbols of absolute authority, echoed with doubt. Ministers questioned his judgment. Generals debated his strategy in hushed tones. The common people, who had long revered the Sultan as almost divine, began to see the limits of his power. Economic strain compounded the political instability. The siege had drained the imperial treasury, leaving debts that would take decades to repay. Supplies sent to the front lines had vanished. Local merchants had overextended credit to feed the army, and taxes had risen to unbearable levels for ordinary citizens. Famine, disease, and a harsh winter had killed thousands, leaving families bereft and communities destabilized. The ripple effect extended across Anatolia, the Balkans, and Levant, testing the loyalty of regions long considered secure. Provinces that once sent tribute willingly now demanded autonomy, their governors emboldened by the perception of weakened central authority. The Janissaries, whose loyalty had once been unquestioned, also began to challenge the Sultan's authority. These elite soldiers, the backbone of Ottoman military power, had been decimated by the campaign. Survivors returned home embittered, questioning the decisions that had led to such unnecessary losses. The Janissaries were no longer merely soldiers. They were a political force. Their discontent could not be ignored, and it required careful diplomacy, concessions, and at times, intimidation to keep them in check. Yet even these measures could only delay the inevitable reckoning that awaited the empire. Meanwhile, Europe watched with keen interest. The failed siege of Vienna demonstrated the Ottoman Empire, long considered unstoppable, could be challenged. The Habsburgs, emboldened by their victory, consolidated alliances across Central Europe. Poland, Austria, and the German states saw opportunity where they had once seen threat. The balance of power shifted incrementally, but irrevocably. Treaties were renegotiated, borders were adjusted, and the psychological impact of the Sultan's failure lingered. The empire, once feared, was now tested at every frontier. Internally, Mustafa II's personal leadership style became a point of contention. He had always been a sultan who valued direct involvement in military campaigns and state affairs. But his tendency to isolate himself and favor advisors who flattered his ambitions created a dangerous echo chamber. Decisions that required careful deliberation were made in haste or without consultation. Critics within the court were silenced, sometimes subtly, sometimes with force. This consolidation of power around personal loyalty, rather than merit, undermined the institutional strength of the empire. It highlighted a recurring theme in history. When rulers fail to temper ambition with counsel, even the mightiest empires can falter. Yet, despite the setbacks, there were glimmers of resilience. Mustafa II understood, at least intellectually, that the empire could not endure repeated failures without adaptation. Efforts were made to reorganize the army, improve supply chains, and stabilize provinces through strategic appointments. Reforms were implemented, albeit slowly, to recover from the financial devastation of the siege. Scholars, diplomats, and military engineers worked tirelessly to rebuild confidence, restore credibility, and secure alliances. The empire's survival depended not on nostalgia for past glory, but on its ability to adapt to new realities. However, adaptation was never enough to erase the psychological scars left by the Sultan's gamble. For generations, European powers cited the siege of Vienna as evidence that the Ottoman Empire, though vast, was not invincible. It became a case study in military academies, a lesson in overreach, hubris, and the limitations of numerical superiority. Historians noted that the empire's failure was not caused solely by tactical mistakes on the battlefield, but by a chain reaction of poor strategic judgment at the highest level. One decision, made in confidence and ambition, had set in motion forces that no single leader could control. The human dimension of his tragedy cannot be overstated. Mustafa II was a man of vision, courage, and intelligence, yet he was also human-prone to error, influenced by ego, and shaped by the culture of absolute monarchy. His fatal decision reflected not only personal flaws, but systemic vulnerabilities. The empire had long relied on centralized power, charismatic leaders, and military might. When those elements failed, there were few institutional safeguards to prevent disaster. Unlike modern states, where checks and balances can moderate reckless action, the Ottoman Empire's fate rested on the judgment of a single individual. And in this case, the Sultan's judgment faltered. The aftermath of the failed siege also revealed the fragility of alliances within the empire. Many regional governors and vassals, sensing weakness at the center, began to test boundaries. Revolts, once suppressed with relative ease, became more frequent and harder to contain. The Ottoman court, preoccupied with damage control in Europe, struggled to maintain authority at home. Loyalty, long considered a given, had to be renegotiated. The empire, once a cohesive and fearsome force, now faced internal pressures that threatened its cohesion from within as well as from without. Religious and cultural factors also played a subtle but significant role. The Ottoman Sultan was not only a political and military leader, he was a caliph, the spiritual head of Sunni Islam. His legitimacy derived in part from his perceived divine sanction. When military failure occurred, it was not merely a strategic loss. It was a symbolic fracture in the perception of divine favor. The people and provincial leaders began to question the narrative of invincibility. The psychological blow, compounded with tangible losses, created an environment of uncertainty that weakened the social fabric of the empire. Despite these pressures, Mustafa II did not surrender to despair. He continued to assert authority, engaging in diplomacy, negotiating peace treaties, and attempting to stabilize the empire's finances. Yet every decision was haunted by the shadow of Vienna. The empire's enemies, aware of the weakened image, probe relentlessly for vulnerabilities. Successive campaigns required careful planning, restraint, and sometimes compromised qualities that were difficult for a sultan accustomed to decisive, unilateral action. Each choice became a balancing act, a negotiation between ambition and survival. The siege of Vienna was only the beginning of a long decline in Ottoman dominance over Europe. Over the next century, the empire faced repeated territorial losses, economic stagnation, and challenges to central authority. Yet the story of Mustafa II serves as a reminder that the seeds of decline are often planted in a single moment. One fatal gamble, driven by ambition and overconfidence, can initiate a trajectory that is difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. The empire's endurance was remarkable, but history would remember it for the vulnerabilities exposed in that fateful campaign. Lessons from this period extend beyond the battlefield. The failure underscores the dangers of centralized authority unchecked by counsel, the risks of overextension, and the necessity of humility in leadership. Mustafa II's story resonates with modern leaders, scholars, and strategists because it illustrates timeless truths. No empire is immune to error, no individual is infallible, and the consequences of hubris can echo across centuries. Perhaps most striking is the human cost of ambition. Thousands of soldiers died, countless families were displaced, and entire communities suffered under strain of mismanaged campaigns. The battlefield was not merely a space of strategy and tactics. It was a landscape of human suffering, courage, and endurance. Every miscalculated order, every delayed decision, carried consequences that were deeply personal for the men and women living under Ottoman rule. History often focuses on leaders and borders, but the siege of Vienna reminds us that the tragedy of ambition is born first and foremost by ordinary people. As the empire sought to recover, new challenges emerged. Reformers within the military advocated modernization, recognizing that outdated tactics and rigid hierarchies would no longer suffice against increasingly organized European forces. Economists and administrators pushed for fiscal reforms, attempting to restore trade, taxation, and infrastructure. Diplomats negotiated with cautious pragmatism, seeking alliances to prevent further erosion of influence. Each effort was a response to cracks exposed by the Sultan's gamble, a reminder that history punishes overreach and rewards adaptability. Yet the shadow of failure lingered in the palace. Mustafa II's authority, though formally intact, was increasingly questioned behind closed doors. Courtiers and ministers who had once supported him began to maneuver subtly, aligning themselves with potential successors or foreign powers. Intrigue, always a feature of imperial courts, intensified as the empire grappled with the dual pressures of external threats and internal instability. Even the Sultan's charisma could not fully shield him from the consequences of his earlier decisions. By the end of Mustafa II's reign, the Ottoman Empire had learned harsh lessons. Military might alone was insufficient to guarantee security or dominance. Centralized authority, while effective in moments of decisiveness, could become a liability when divorced from strategic counsel. Leadership required not only courage but prudence, not only ambition but wisdom. And above all, history revealed that the line between triumph and catastrophe was often perilously thin, determined by choices made in moments of extraordinary pressure. The siege of Vienna and its aftermath marked a turning point in the Ottoman narrative. What followed was an era defined by adaptation, reform, and incremental retreat. Borders would be renegotiated, armies modernized, and governance restructured. The empire would survive for more than 2 centuries beyond Mustafa II, but the psychological blow of overreach and miscalculation would resonate long after the battlefield was abandoned. Historians often point to Vienna as the beginning of the end for Ottoman dominance in Europe, not because the empire collapsed immediately, but because the seeds of vulnerability had been irreversibly sown. Through this lens, Mustafa II emerges as both tragic and instructive. He was a visionary who dreamed of glory, a man who sought to immortalize his legacy through decisive action. Yet his human limitations, compounded by systemic vulnerabilities, led to a gamble that nearly destroyed centuries of empire building. His story is not merely a chronicle of defeat. It is a profound study in complexities of leadership, the perils of hubris, and the unpredictable consequences of ambition. And so, the empire endured, but it did so under the shadow of a single decision, a reminder that history is often determined not by the inevitability of fate, but by the choices of those in power. Ambition drives empires forward, but unchecked, it can also bring them to their knees. Mustafa II's gamble serves as a timeless testament to the fragility of power, the weight of responsibility, an enduring lesson that even the mightiest empire can be toppled by the decisions of one man. Even as the empire struggled to recover, the shadow of Mustafa II's gamble lingered over every decision. The palace, once a symbol of unchallenged authority, had become a place of quiet caution. Ministers weighed every recommendation with the memory of Vienna looming large. Generals approached campaigns with an acute awareness that mistakes could no longer be tolerated. Provinces, once obedient in their loyalty, tested boundaries more boldly. And across Europe, foreign powers treated the Ottoman Empire not as an unstoppable colossus, but as a force that could be outmaneuvered, tested, and even challenged with success. In this climate of heightened scrutiny and fragile authority, the Sultan faced the limitations of charisma and ambition. His prior successes could no longer mask the consequences of failure. Mustafa II realized that the empire's survival depended not merely on military might, but on careful stewardship of resources, measured diplomacy, and the cultivation of internal stability. Rebuilding trust became as important as rebuilding armies. Loyalty had to be earned, rather than assumed. Alliances had to be carefully nurtured. And the empire's reputation, once taken for granted, required deliberate management. Yet, even with these lessons, human nature proved a persistent challenge. Mustafa II's temperament, shaped by years of absolute power, still inclined him toward decisive action and bold gestures. While prudence became a necessary skill, the temptation of ambition never fully disappeared. It was a delicate balance. The same qualities that had inspired the empire's expansion now had to be harnessed to prevent further disaster. Every council meeting, every military campaign, every diplomatic negotiation carried the weight of past failures and the fear of repeating them. History, as it often does, reminded the Sultan that the consequences of one choice could reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. This period also exposed the systemic vulnerabilities of an empire that had grown so vast and diverse. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a singular, cohesive entity. It was a mosaic of cultures, languages, and religions. Maintaining unity required not just force, but negotiation, compromise, and cultural sensitivity. Governors wielded significant power in distant provinces, and the central authority had to navigate their ambitions carefully. The rebellion of one faction, the defection of a single province, could spiral into broader instability. The failure at Vienna demonstrated that the empire's strength lay not solely in armies and artillery, but in cohesion, trust, and effective governance. The military, once the empire's unquestioned instrument of power, underwent significant reform. Lessons learned from the failed siege highlighted deficiencies in supply chains, training, and strategic coordination. Commanders now had to anticipate not only the enemy's movements, but also logistical challenges, morale issues, and the unpredictable variables of war. The Janissaries, embittered by their losses, were both a stabilizing force and a potential threat. Their loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. It had to be managed, cultivated, and sometimes coerced. The empire's survival hinged on the delicate equilibrium between authority, discipline, and pragmatic concessions. Yet the story of Mustafa II is more than a military narrative. It is a cautionary tale about leadership, ambition, and the fragile nature of power. Leaders, whether in empires or modern states, often face moments where decisions carry disproportionate consequences. The Sultan's gamble illustrates the intoxicating allure of ambition and the peril inherent in ignoring counsel. It demonstrates that even a ruler with vast resources, loyal subjects, and strategic advantage can falter when human limitations, pride, impatience, overconfidence come into play. The Ottoman Empire, once thought invincible, was reminded that resilience requires humility as much as strength. As decades passed, the empire slowly adapted. Borders were fortified, trade routes restored, and administrative structures modernized. The lessons of Vienna were never forgotten. They informed military doctrine, diplomatic strategy, and internal governance for generations. Mustafa II's reign, though marked by a single catastrophic misjudgment, ultimately became a turning point, a reference point for leaders, historians, and strategists who studied the consequences of ambition unchecked by prudence. The psychological impact of the failed siege endured long after the battlefield had emptied. Soldiers who survived carried memories of loss and valor. Families mourned the men who never returned. Communities rebuilt under the shadow of scarcity and fear. The empire's subjects, once assured of their sultan's near-divine wisdom, became acutely aware of the human limitations of leadership. And in the corridors of power, whispers of caution became louder than the echoes of past glory. The empire's identity, once bound to the notion of invincibility, now included humility and adaptability as central themes of survival. For the historian, the story of Mustafa II offers profound insights into the intersection of personality, circumstance, and historical consequence. It demonstrates that history is rarely shaped by abstract forces alone. It is shaped by individuals, by their choices, their flaws, and their visions. One sultan's gamble, a single decision made with conviction, pride, and ambition, had consequences that echoed for generations. It reshaped the political landscape of Europe, altered the course of Ottoman governance, and provided a template for the study of leadership, risk, and responsibility. It is tempting to view the events of 1683 as inevitable in hindsight, but history is never predetermined. At every moment, alternative paths existed. Mustafa II could have delayed the campaign, consolidated forces, sought broader counsel, or negotiated with rival powers. A single choice, a single moment of restraint, could have preserved the empire's momentum and prolonged its dominance. The stark reality is that empires rise and fall on decisions made in the here and now, often without the luxury of foresight. The Sultan's fatal gamble is a reminder of the weight that rests on the shoulders of those entrusted with power. The human story at the heart of this historical drama is equally compelling. Soldiers fought bravely, citizens endured hardship, and generals attempted to reconcile loyalty with pragmatism. The consequences of Mustafa II's ambition were not abstract. They were intensely personal, tangible, and immediate. Generations bore the cost of decisions made in the heat of ambition. Families mourned sons and fathers. Provinces experienced famine and economic collapse, and the social fabric of the empire was tested as never before. History, in this sense, is not simply a record of leaders, borders, and treaties. It is a tapestry of human experience, suffering, and resilience. In the centuries that followed, the Ottoman Empire would face numerous challenges: wars with rising European powers, internal revolts, and the pressures of modernization. Yet the shadow of the Sultan's gamble remained an enduring lesson. Leaders and scholars repeatedly turned to Vienna as a case study in hubris, strategic miscalculation, and the fragility of authority. The siege became emblematic of the thin line between triumph and disaster, and the Sultan's decision remained a symbol of both ambition and cautionary failure. Even as the empire adapted and endured, the cultural and psychological impact of the failed campaign was profound. Literature, art, and oral history preserve the narrative of ambition, sacrifice, and loss. The Sultan's gamble entered collective memory as both a source of fascination and a warning. Across the empire, the story reminded citizens and leaders alike that no empire, regardless of its size or power, could survive unchecked ambition without wisdom, counsel, and prudence. In the end, Mustafa II's story is one of paradox. It is a story of a man of vision who sought glory, a ruler whose ambition drove both greatness and disaster. It is a story of an empire that endured centuries yet was shaken to its foundations by a single gamble. And it is the story of history itself. A reminder that the fate of nations often rests on the choices of individuals, that ambition can inspire greatness or precipitate ruin, and that the human element, pride, passion, and fallibility is central to the narrative of power. The Sultan's last gamble left an indelible mark. It reshaped the trajectory of the Ottoman Empire, redefined its relationships with Europe, and provided enduring lessons in leadership and responsibility. The empire's eventual decline cannot be traced to one event alone, but the siege of Vienna stands as a pivotal moment when ambition collided with reality, when vision met the limits of human endurance. Mustafa II's failed decision reminds us that history is a living tapestry, woven from the choices, triumphs, and mistakes of those who hold power. And so, as we reflect on this tale centuries later, the echoes of that fateful campaign remind us that ambition must be tempered with wisdom, that leadership is a burden as much as a privilege, and that even the mightiest empires are ultimately human. The Ottoman Empire, vast, formidable, and enduring, serves as both a monument to human achievement and a cautionary tale of the fragile line between greatness and ruin. Mustafa II's story is not simply history. It is a lesson, a warning, and an enduring testament to the consequences of one man's ambition, a reminder that the fate of nations often rests on the decisions of a single individual, and that those decisions can change the course of history forever.